Hi, welcome everyone to another episode of Health Matters. So today's topic is going to be autoimmune. Autoimmune is one of my favorite subjects. It's one of the things that we really help a lot of people with when they come into the practice. And so the first thing I want to mention is that autoimmune is not a necessarily fixed state that you have to be in, meaning that there is the potential for it to be reversible. And if not reversible, at least more manageable, where someone is not going into flares as significantly and as often as maybe they have in the past. The other thing is that autoimmune is pretty complicated to unpack and resolve some of the flares, the symptoms, possibly even go into what might be a remission for some. So, all right, well, let's really dive in here. All right. So I want to talk about how everyone is at risk for autoimmune. uh, Even if there are certain genomic markers that test positive or negative for a downregulation. The reality is that we're all vulnerable to autoimmune. And the reason that we're all vulnerable is there is a reason or a multitude of reasons, if you will, when the body might go into a dysregulation of the immune system. So autoimmune means the immune system is somewhat attacking the self, generating antibodies. And in modern and diagnostic medicine, sometimes it's not even tested for, especially thyroid antibodies. Women, if you are getting your thyroid checked or if you are um, have been diagnosed with Hashimoto's but don't check your antibodies, you really should look at those antibodies. A lot of times it's not looked at because in most modern medicine circles, nothing can really be done about it. So whether the number goes up or down, or whether it's even there, doesn't matter. They're looking at your numbers like your TSH, T3, and T4, so they can prescribe medicine and then keep that medicine regulated. But because there are so many influencers and factors that go into why someone's immune system might do this, for us, it's super important. And for us, it's kind of an easy way of checking someone's progress, looking at thyroid antibodies, and as we're doing all the work in the body to try and bring it back into balance, to check on those antibodies to see the percentage of progress that's being made. So that's kind of the first thing is that sometimes, especially around the thyroid, it's not even tested. So again, make sure you get your thyroid antibodies added to your annual. If you're having your thyroid tested regularly to maintain medicine, then, maybe even once or twice a year getting those checked as well. Again, because it's a message from the body, right? I'm really big on like, what is our body telling us and sorting out what is within our kind of personal responsibility. What are the areas we can do something about? What are the areas that we just can't? And finding that balance and that sweet spot. So when we talk about autoimmune, we're going to go through a checklist of things that might be present in the body. And the first thing we start out with is the microbiome, otherwise known as the gut. So when there are infections that have entered the body, primarily in the gut, it can set a chain reaction into the immune system. Remember that 70% of our immune system is in our gut. So again, there can be kind of a chain reaction, especially as the gut might assimilate the organisms into its ecosystem, and the immune system is going, Like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And like sends kind of a message out. It's a really oversimplified version of like what the science is, but again, it's the primary place that we start when working on autoimmune, especially thyroid. Thyroid is so closely related to gut function. And so, if there's issues in the thyroid, we want to be looking at the gut, measuring progress in antibodies can let us know if we're really kind of addressing that. So, in the microbiome, we have trillions of organisms. They are as unique as our fingerprint. So, again, this is where we start to get pretty complicated. Super unique is that ecosystem. And those organisms essentially, in a way, could live outside our body. So, there's certain cells that, organisms that wouldn't live outside our body. Our intestinal tract is somewhat encased, and they feed off of what we feed them and other things. So it's not like they would completely live outside the body, but they are very much an independent system that rests inside of us. So imagine that we are the kind of the space station, and those are a little bit of spaceships and soldiers that kind of occupy that and can be, again, pretty complicated. So within that system, we have viruses, fungi, and bacteria. So, in the world of autoimmune, sometimes a virus may not necessarily have um, nested, if you will, in the gut, but it can be influencing the way that the immune system in the gut is trying to regulate the immune system. So, we're talking about viruses like COVID. Um, it's kind of talked about as long COVID and is it as if we've never seen this before. But this is what viruses do. They do like to kind of nest in a way. COVID is kind of talked about as like a sticky protein that kind of is that nesting. Again, this is what viruses do. Some of you in the world of functional health may have heard of Lyme disease that originates from a virus. And again, the way the body is able to deal with that can be somewhat hyperactive, right? And in autoimmune, with the dysregulation of the immune system, you have part of the immune system is overstimulated and overperforming. That's where it might be kind of attacking itself or making antibodies. And some of it might be underperforming, where it just kind of get a handle on what's going on. And so it's a little bit about bringing those two things together. That's where it can get pretty complicated. How do you get the part of the immune system that's underperforming to rally and to detoxify, especially some of the original organisms that are wreaking havoc, but not overstimulating the part that gets overstimulated and puts someone into a flare. Pretty tricky finding that balance. That's where it gets super complicated as well. So that's something to kind of consider, that die off. That's a common term in functional holistic when, you're killing organisms or you're reducing the population of organisms and you're trying not to create a uh, flare reaction, right? Those symptoms are the way your body is talking to you and telling you, pay attention. This is where we need to pay attention. There's also another reason why it does that, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But we want to go, what is my body trying to tell me? I think that that's the number one biggest mistake we make in managing our entire health is that we kind of go, this is bothering me, or what's wrong with me, or there's so many things that I'm dealing with, instead of kind of taking a step back and almost being a little bit of an observer and go, what is my body trying to tell me? Is this something going on uh, in my gut? Is this something going on in my immune system? Have I contributed to this by eating something? Am I under significant stress? Am I trying to deal with something, some kind of crisis? And this is a distraction. So, again, complicated. to kind of say, hey, and that's where bringing in someone like the way we work, where you'd unpack it, even with different symptoms and flares, and go, hey, what's triggering me right now as we're getting the body into a balanced state? Sometimes the body doesn't want to go into balance. It has decided that this immune response is a way it's protecting itself. It's a way that it is managing that environment, that microbiome, that ecosystem, if you will. And so it can get a little bit upset, and that can make it that much more complicated, pushing through what it feels is its homeostasis. So, fungi, overgrowth of yeast, candida, there's different forms of yeast that occupy the body. We all carry these organisms in our body. The problem is when they have overpopulated or have kind of gotten in, like with viruses, they kind of gotten stuck in the wrong place. Fungi can travel, people that are prone to nail fungus or yeast infection may also have yeast overgrowth in their gut, even if they don't understand that their symptoms could be related to that. So, um, and yeast isn't just fed by like sugar and processed carbs, it can also be affected by high levels of stress. And so, we're constantly changing our microbiome through stress response as well. We all know that feeling of butterflies in our stomach, or having a nervous tummy, or feeling so nervous with something we just don't feel right in our gut. And that's because there is a communication that goes on here. Um, and so our emotional state is going to affect the gut. And so that can be something that really needs to be kind of looked at. So, infections in the gut, going through that checklist of, is there H. pylori? Is there bacteria in the stomach? SIBO, is there small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? Is there fungal overgrowth? Is there something going on in the large intestine? And so this can be a pretty in-depth way of kind of exploring where your immune system has dysregulated and kind of getting that back into balance. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about hormonal imbalances, and a little bit of an overlap to the gut when we talk about blood sugar imbalances. So estrogen dominance is something that a lot of people don't really understand or associate with gut or with autoimmune. So it is something to look at and consider. Again, as an influencer, um, when we talk about functional health, chronic systemic issues, we are talking about like root cause. My position is always to say, we're going to go to the root cause of the root cause. So, how do these things kind of intersect? And again, estrogen dominance can be caused by a number of things. It can be caused by what's going on in the gut. If the gut is imbalanced enough to have created biofilm, that is kind of it's a cellular matrix that acts like a webbing, or a slime is also how it's referred. And it can trap a lot of organisms on it, underneath it, behind it. And that can make it very difficult for the microbiome to balance itself, and for the immune system to kind of understand what's going on. They're here somewhere, where are they? They might be hiding in the biofilm, behind the biofilm. Biofilm is essential in most detoxification protocols. If that is a misstep, it can really cause someone a much longer process, or a kind of a regression, or moving in and out of, their progress. So, estrogen. We recommend saliva and blood to look at something like this because sometimes estrogen is normal in blood, but it is not in saliva. And so that's how your body's using it. Remember, estrogen is in all the organs in the body. Women are more inclined to have more estrogen than men, but men can wind up in estrogen dominance. It's not even really even tested. Men are looking at their testosterone. So it definitely is a consideration if you're really struggling with autoimmune or you're, really kind of strong-minded on getting it under control or seeing if you can go into a much more balanced or even a state of what we would call kind of a remission, if you will. And so that is pretty important. That's pretty important. Adrenal fatigue. So this is kind of its own thing, and this can get people stuck into a loop. So your adrenals are going to um, respond to stress with hormones like cortisol, DHEA. So sometimes people that are really under high stress, their cortisol doesn't quite know how to regulate. They might be overproducing cortisol. That's not sustainable. They might be depleted in cortisol. People in adrenal fatigue might be in a variety of different places with their cortisol production. So it's not always, oh, I'm exhausted, my cortisol might be too low, or oh, I am this, my cortisol might be too high. So pretty important to look at that. Again, we look at that in saliva. It is a better and more accurate way of looking at, and again, that stress response. So if the adrenals become involved in overproducing or underproducing cortisol, that's a chronic stress response that also becomes a constant state of physical stress, and that can affect the gut. So now there's like this loop that someone can get stuck in where, for example, like histamines have a strong relationship in the gut and autoimmune. It can sometimes cause cells to not always be as calm as we want them to be. And so, again, something like estrogen produces more histamines produces more estrogen. Stress creates more histamines or the cells to release more histamines. And then that puts the body under physical stress, which taxes the adrenals. So, if I haven't said complicated enough, it's complicated and also kind of getting uh, unstuck out of these loops, right? Because they can just be a perpetual. This is also why sometimes autoimmune is just like, looks like it's this constant state. Um, and also why people might go into flares. Is that flare related to something that is going on in your gut, whether it be food that you've eaten, high histamines, stress the body out, too much sugar processed food, chemical ingredients? Are you under stress and that's affected your gut health? So it can get pretty complicated when we look at how stress hormonally plays a part in this. And then, of course, if someone is in insulin resistance or can't control their blood sugar, that's actually, again, going to affect the gut. It's going to cause the body to be under a state of stress. It does affect hormones. We're going back and forth here. So, again, when we peel back all the layers, we unpack this. We're doing it here in a little bit of like a check list. We gather all the data and we're going this, and this is how we start to look at this. All right, so now we get into something that I could do a whole episode on, and I probably will. So I'm just going to touch upon this lightly to just bring more awareness into the autoimmune conversation, and that's trauma. So that word is being used a little bit more frequently and with positivity around it. But let's talk about kind of the different aspects of this and how it plays a part in autoimmune. So, if someone has gone through childhood abuse, then during their childhood while their immune system is developing, especially as they move into puberty. Their immune system can kind of set up a little bit of a foundation to be hyper vigilant. So often, children of abuse are a little bit more um, prone to being much more walking on eggshells, much more looking out for strategizing for their safety in a variety of fight, flight, freeze responses. But while the body is in a developmental phase, it can affect the way the body is setting up its immune system for adulthood. So making that very vulnerable. About 80% of humans are in dysfunctional families. So there are varying degrees of dysfunction, varying degrees of abuse. Again, we're all a little bit vulnerable to that autoimmune. So that's a consideration because often, again, the body is going, this is how I perceive homeostasis. So if the cytokines, the immune system, the cells are laying down a train track, if you will, for that autoimmune, that's a place where some maybe deep work needs to be done. Um, Sometimes there is a level of physical distraction that the body will create to be in a survival mode. So, the way I like to explain it is the conscious mind is involved in our sanity, the subconscious mind is involved in our survival. Well, our survival is actually always going to trump sanity. So, sometimes this is a way where the body is trying to actually deal with something traumatic, again, high stress, chronic stress that might be triggering to past trauma, complicated. Again, if I haven't said complicated enough, I'm going to go there. So when we help people with their body and their microbiome, then there is a conversation around, is there mind work that needs to be done? Is there spirit, right? But mind, body, spirit. I look at the whole body as being the mind, body, spirit microbiome, like four significant elements. And we are our diet and lifestyle, which includes stress, sleep, what we're eating, our microbiome as a fundamental pillar of health. If anyone's listened to my 3 pillars of health episode, and our genetic makeup, which is evolving, and these all intertwine. There's something called epigenetic that's affecting diet and lifestyle, microbiome affect genetics. This then in turns affect that. So again, it's all working together. The body's working together. Sometimes messaging us to pay attention to something, sometimes distracting us because maybe it might be too emotionally painful to do that work. So, what are we called to do, and what makes sense going through the checklist to kind of address these things? Because sometimes you can't even get to doing mind work unless you've kind of cleaned out the gut, kind of started to work on balancing some chemicals. So it kind of is unique to the person which way they want to start. Some people are doing work on trauma and not even considering it a significant step in working on their autoimmune. So that is something to think about and kind of look at whether or not that's a consideration. I do think it's important to just know that it's a possibility of being an influencer on your autoimmune and having a conversation about it with yourself and seeing where you want to go in terms of that. Metal toxicity. So now we're going to talk about metal toxicity, mold toxicity. So there can be a level of toxicity in the body that someone has been exposed to. Mold is very trendy right now. There's a lot of misinformation on it. We all come in contact with mold. Most of our environment has some exposure to mold. It's a question of biofilm and detox pathways. Can your body deal with mold? And also, where is your mold coming from? A lot of people assume it's just an environmental issue. Most of our mold is actually coming to us from the food we eat and the drink we drink. Coffee has some of the highest concentration of mold in any of the food that we consume. We can't be looking at necessarily mold in the house if we're not going to also look on how we're pouring mold right into our body on an ongoing basis. There are mold-free coffees. Some are better than others. Do your research if you're trying to look at that. Grains contain a lot of mold, peanuts. So looking at where your mold might be coming from. Good detox if for mold and metals usually contain similar things to them. But again, if you're not doing the work on that biofilm, you're only going to do superficial detoxification and you're not going to get into that next level. We highly recommend doing that under the care of someone who really understands biofilm so that you understand how to protect yourself from flares, die off, things of this nature, doing it very strategically in a linear manner so you can keep yourself as comfortable as possible, as managing symptoms, keeping yourself out of huge flares. So that's a really significant thing to understand and remember that needs to be done in a step that makes sense with someone who can kind of help guide you, educate, and strategize with you through that. So, two pieces to think about also in that checklist as you're thinking about what is all going into my autoimmune bucket, trauma. That can be anything from childhood abuse to significant periods of chronic stress to actual other significant events of trauma. Having a huge illness can be traumatic. So, something like that. It doesn't have to be just something that is mental and emotional. It can be something that's actually been a physical thing that someone's gone through. So, looking at that, someone has PTSD, that's traumatic, and that can create an ongoing series of triggers. Again, that work needs to be done with someone of that profession that can handle and take you through that process. You'll want to do that with someone that has the credentials for that that can really help you. What I want to do as a health educator is to bring awareness that that's part of your autoimmune, and as you're taking on your whole body, bringing it into balance, something that you want to consider. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about with regard to autoimmune are key nutritional deficiencies that might be impacting the way that your body is behaving. So, especially nutrients that are involved in fortifying the immune system. Vitamin D, it's a simple one. We think often that if we're out in the sun, we have enough, but more and more people have low vitamin D levels. Often vitamin D is associated with other nutrients. So sometimes vitamin D isn't absorbed if someone is ineffective in breaking down their fats correctly in their gut. So now again, we're back to a gut issue, or if they have a greater need for magnesium and they're not getting enough to meet that need, that can affect vitamin D. So some of these nutrients are connected to other nutrients. Again, this symbiotic relationship. Sometimes vitamin A, so antioxidants, those types of deficiencies can lead to an environment that's more prone to autoimmune. Vitamin K, certain B vitamins, and having a big functional panel where you can like look at some of these nutrients. Yes, you can add vitamin D to regular blood work, but looking at it a little bit more in depth is something that you might consider as a possible look at all again looking at influencers on your autoimmune as a checklist that you can kind of go through and go, what am I checking that is a contributing factor? a little bit like imagining your autoimmune is a bonfire and looking at what are the logs and the kindling and what's some of the lighter fluid we're putting on. In terms of diet, when we talk about nutrient deficiencies and nutrition, we can talk about things like sugar's effect on the immune system. Refined sugars can impact the immune system negatively. And so, with repeated excess of this, it can cause the immune system to kind of not know how to behave. So, that's something to kind of think about. Um, gluten Gluten is very inflammatory to a lot of autoimmune. It's often narrowly looked at as a something that is involved in celiac. Well, celiac disease is an autoimmune of the small intestine, and most people are most adversely reactive and in a flare if they come in contact with gluten. But all autoimmune is affected by gluten to varying degrees, and sometimes joint pain can be associated with gluten. So there's a variety of different ways of looking at different inflammatory foods and seeing if you're reactive, maybe even making a list and taking each one out for a period of time, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Upon reintroduction is where you're more likely to see a flare. Sometimes the elimination doesn't resolve anything. um, Statistics say that it takes 2 years of eliminating gluten for antibodies on the thyroid to come down, if that's the only nutritional strategy that is done. So, thinking that it might be a quick fix is not really what's happening, but also thinking that that's the one thing. 70% of people with celiac disease still are having health problems. That means just the elimination of gluten isn't going to be the single answer to why their intestines are um, not behaving correctly and inflamed. Again, it's a combination of factors, and being able to look at them, taking on like one section at a time, whether that's microbiome and looking at the gut, or then hormones and looking at that. Sometimes having all the data and creating a strategy like that is helpful. Sometimes, again, just kind of taking on one chunk at a time. And lastly, I'll end with something that can impact the immune system, and that is our oral health. So, in general, when we think about the biome, microbiome, we have several. We have the one that's inside our gut, we have the one that's outside our skin. The face has a different chemistry to its organisms. That's why we care for our face differently than our body with different skincare, and the mouth. So, coming full circle to looking at the gut means looking at the biome in the mouth. And so often issues along the gum line, over cleaning. Sometimes it's not cleaning enough or not addressing it correctly. Sometimes it's overdoing it. Sometimes it's as simple as using a chemical version of fluoride that is impacting the way that um, your thyroid could behave. So you never know if that's an impact. And so again, being very strategic and methodical and taking on one thing at a time, looking at how your body is talking to you, what messages is the body trying to tell me. Even with COVID, we saw people who, if they were um, gut had more issues along the gum line, receding gum disease, more issues with their oral health. They were more likely to come down with a more serious version of COVID, when it was much more serious in its symptoms. So we have to think about our whole body differently, especially in autoimmune. It's a call to thinking about your body differently as a whole, but in segments almost, and looking at how is my whole body um, out of balance as opposed to I have autoimmune here and I want to manage these symptoms, and looking at like why am I in this state? How can I get my immune system to behave better? Is there a way that I need to look at my health a little bit differently so I can start to unpack this and then put those pieces together? Thanks for listening. I hope to see you again.